The weight of the courtroom. The air inside the Maplewood County Courthouse felt thick, suffocating almost, though the air conditioning hummed relentlessly from vents hidden in the aged crown molding above. The courthouse had stood for over 70 years, its marble floors worn dull in places where thousands of nervous feet had shuffled over the decades. It was the kind of building whose every creak and groan seemed to whisper stories of lives forever altered within its walls. On this particular morning, the building seemed to buzz with an extra current of tension, as if the very walls knew something monumental was about to unfold. Teresa Allen, a black woman in her mid-40s, stood near the entrance, her slender fingers tightening around the handle of a plain leather briefcase. There was nothing particularly striking about her appearance. Simple black blazer, modest skirt, low heels, yet she radiated a quiet intensity that made people step aside as she moved down the hall. It was not confidence, but a kind of weariness honed into resilience, a sharpness that came only from fighting battles no one else saw. The corridor was already crowded with people, anxious defendants in ill-fitting clothes, public defenders juggling files, police officers leaning against the walls, their arms crossed, eyes sharp and impersonal. This was the courthouse's morning rush, the human assembly line of justice, where each case was processed, judged, and stamped in assembly line efficiency. Teresa had been there before, on the receiving end of polite corporate dismissals, of whispered jokes made just loud enough to be heard, but not loud enough to be confronted. But today was different. Today, she wasn't there as a bystander or statistic. Today, she was there to stand up for herself, to demand, for once, that her story be heard. Her case wasn't criminal. It was civil, a discrimination suit against her former employer, Braybridge & Co., a prestigious marketing firm with a spotless public reputation and a much darker internal culture. Teresa had spent nearly 2 decades at Braybridge, starting as an eager assistant account manager and working her way up through the ranks despite the invisible ceiling that seemed to lower itself each time she got close to breaking through. Her work was impeccable. No one questioned that. Clients praised her creativity, her leadership, her problem-solving abilities. But promotions always seemed to slip just out of reach. Male colleagues, often younger, less experienced, and less qualified, were nudged ahead of her, invited to after-hours drinks where strategies were discussed and alliances were formed. Teresa was rarely invited, and when she was, she always found herself outnumbered, out-talked, and overlooked. It wasn't until a new regional director arrived that the real hostility began. Comments, at first subtle, then progressively bolder. "Teresa, you're great, but maybe a more traditional face would make clients more comfortable." Feedback like, "You're a little intense, maybe soften your approach, be more approachable." And the performance reviews, once glowing, suddenly grew vague and critical, full of nebulous complaints that couldn't be pinned to anything concrete. The final blow came when she was terminated without warning, her position allegedly eliminated for cost-cutting reasons, though no one else in her department had been laid off. That was the day Teresa decided enough was enough. She found an attorney, Damon Fielding, a civil rights lawyer with a reputation for being relentless. They spent months gathering evidence, piecing together a timeline of discrimination so systemic it was almost textbook. There were emails, colleagues joking about Teresa's urban vibe, or questioning whether she'd fit in with certain clients. Performance reviews that contradicted her actual work output. Even client praise that had been deliberately excluded from her personnel file. Teresa had believed, perhaps naively, that once this evidence was presented, the injustice would be clear. But the legal process was its own battlefield, where the truth was only one piece of a much larger chess game. Her former employer hired a top-tier legal team, the kind with slick suits and endless resources, experts at painting Teresa as difficult, combative, or simply a bad fit. As Teresa stood in the hallway that morning, waiting for her hearing to begin, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. Every sideways glance, every polite smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, every subtle reminder that she didn't belong here. It all clung to her like humidity before a storm. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every black woman who had ever been told to shrink themselves to fit a space never designed for them. Across the hall, Sergeant Kyle Whittaker leaned against the wall near the courtroom door, his thumbs hooked into his belt. Tall, broad, with the unshakable posture of someone who'd worn the badge long enough for it to become part of his spine. Whittaker wasn't new to courthouse security duty, but something about Teresa caught his attention the moment she walked in. She was too calm, too composed. Most people facing court hearings, even civil ones, showed cracks in their composure, the nerves peeking through in their fidgeting, in their darting eyes. Not Teresa. She stood straight, eyes steady, the calm before a storm. Whittaker didn't dislike her, but his instincts flared. Trouble often came packaged in defiance, and defiance was written all over her face. Inside Courtroom 4A, Judge Elizabeth Corman presided. Known for her icy demeanor and intolerance for theatrics, Judge Corman had no patience for drawn-out testimony or impassioned pleas. Facts, evidence, procedure, that was her creed. Teresa and Damon had prepared accordingly, but there was always the lingering question: would the facts even matter when the system itself was rigged? The courtroom filled slowly, a small scattering of curious onlookers, a few reporters scribbling in notebooks, and Braybridge's legal team, 4 attorneys in matching navy suits, exuding corporate confidence. When Teresa entered, she felt the weight of every eye in the room shift toward her. Some were curious, others dismissive, and a few were openly hostile. She took her seat beside Damon, who offered a reassuring smile, but the tension in his jaw gave him away. "This is it," Damon whispered. "Stay calm. We have the truth." Teresa nodded, but calm was a distant shore. The judge entered, the gavel fell, and the hearing began. Braybridge's attorneys opened with a narrative so polished it gleamed. Teresa was a valued employee, but had struggled to adapt to changing corporate culture. They spoke of restructuring, of unfortunate misunderstandings, and difficult but necessary decisions. They painted Teresa not as a victim, but as a competent professional who simply wasn't a fit for the company's evolving vision. When Damon took the floor, his presentation was less polished but far more piercing. He walked the court through emails laced with coded language, performance evaluations that grew inexplicably critical, and internal documents showing positions eliminated only to be immediately reposted with slightly different titles. It was all there, a mosaic of discrimination, subtle enough to dodge immediate detection, but clear as day when viewed in full. Teresa watched the judge's face, searching for a flicker of reaction. There was none. When it was Teresa's turn to speak, she rose with trembling hands but a firm voice. "I gave 20 years to Braybridge," she said. "I built client relationships, led successful campaigns, mentored younger employees. I met every metric, exceeded expectations, until it became inconvenient for me to exist." The judge's gaze sharpened slightly, but before Teresa could continue, one of Braybridge's lawyers objected. "Irrelevant personal opinion." "Stick to the facts, Ms. Allen," Judge Corman said coolly. But facts alone had never been enough to tell the whole story. As Teresa tried to continue, the judge's impatience mounted. When Teresa insisted on presenting new evidence, emails only uncovered the night before, the judge's veneer cracked. "That's enough, Ms. Allen," Judge Corman snapped. "If you cannot follow procedure, you will be removed." It was the first crack in a dam already under strain. Teresa stood her ground, her heart pounding, her voice steady. And then, the courtroom door swung open. A breathless clerk stumbled in, clutching a phone. "Your Honor, there's a call for you." The entire room froze. "From where?" Judge Corman asked, annoyed. The clerk swallowed hard. "The White House." A shift in the air. The silence that followed those 3 words, "the White House," was absolute. Even the air in the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, Teresa wondered if she had misheard, if the months of stress had finally fractured her mind, and she was imagining things. But the wide-eyed, sweat-slicked face of the clerk told her it was real. The judge's gavel hung in midair, her fingers clenched around it so tightly her knuckles blanched. "The White House," the clerk repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "They're on the line. They're asking for you directly, Your Honor." Teresa's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. The courtroom, just moments earlier a cramped container of simmering tension, had become a vacuum where all the air was sucked out. Braybridge's lead attorney, a tall man with perfect silver hair and a permanent smirk, visibly paled, his confidence cracking like thin ice underfoot. Judge Corman stood slowly, her black robe shifting like the wings of a restless crow. Her expression was impossible to read, somewhere between suspicion and irritation, with the faintest trace of unease. "This court is in recess," she announced abruptly, her voice a carefully balanced mask of authority. "Everyone is to remain in the building until further notice." The gavel struck, a hollow sound, and then the judge swept past the stunned faces, vanishing through the heavy wooden door that led to her chambers. The clerk, still looking half-shocked, stumbled after her, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Teresa sat back down heavily, her mind a whirlwind. The White House. What could they possibly want with her case? This wasn't some high-profile political scandal, and she wasn't anyone important. At least, not in the way power brokers usually noticed. She was just a black woman who refused to be pushed out of a job without a fight. Damon, her lawyer, leaned toward her, whispering, "Teresa, did you contact anyone at the White House? Civil rights groups? Activists? Journalists?" "No," she whispered back, throat dry. "I don't even know anyone who could do that." His brow furrowed, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "Then someone's been watching. Watching her. From where? How?" The thought sent a shiver down her spine. At the defense table, Braybridge's legal team whispered furiously, their heads ducked together in a huddle of panic. The polished corporate armor they'd worn into court was starting to crack at the edges, like paint bubbling under heat. The courtroom deputy, Sergeant Kyle Whittaker, stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, his face tight with confusion. This wasn't procedure. Courts operated under their own insulated world, and outside interference, especially from the White House, was practically unheard of. Whittaker had seen plenty of drama in his years on courthouse duty, but nothing like this. He wasn't the only one wondering. In the hallways, whispers swirled like wildfire, speculation spreading from clerk to bailiff to lawyers pacing anxiously. The White House calling about a discrimination case in a suburban county courthouse. Unthinkable. But it had happened. Inside Judge Corman's chambers, the judge stood behind her desk, the phone held awkwardly between her ear and her shoulder as she flipped through Teresa's case file. Her normally impassive face was pulled into a tight frown, and her eyes darted over the paperwork as though searching for something she might have missed. Some connection, some reason this case had attracted the attention of the most powerful office in the country. "Understood," she said into the phone, her voice a forced calm that betrayed the rapid thud of her pulse. "Yes, I'm aware of the potential implications." There was a pause, and then, "Yes, Mr. Secretary. I'll ensure her testimony is heard in full." She hung up the phone with deliberate care, but when her fingers left the receiver, her hand trembled, just for a moment, so briefly it could have been imagined. Her clerk stood across the room, pale and fidgeting, waiting for instruction. "Bring Sergeant Whittaker to me," Judge Corman ordered, her voice regaining its customary frost. "And find Ms. Allen's counsel. I want them both in my chambers immediately." The clerk practically ran from the room, leaving the door swinging half open behind him. Teresa and Damon were led into the judge's chambers 10 minutes later, accompanied by Sergeant Whittaker, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The room was small, more practical than grand, its shelves lined with leather-bound legal tomes whose spines were faded from years of use. There were no personal touches, no photos, no diplomas displayed, nothing to hint at the woman who spent her days delivering verdicts. Judge Corman was seated behind her desk, her hands clasped tightly on the surface, her gaze piercing. She wasn't used to being summoned, much less by powers far above her jurisdiction. "Please sit," she said, motioning stiffly to the two wooden chairs across from her desk. Teresa perched on the edge of her seat, Damon settling beside her with a wary glance at the judge. "I'll be frank," Judge Corman began. "I've just received a phone call from the White House." Teresa's stomach knotted. Even hearing it aloud sounded surreal. "The Secretary of the Department of Justice has expressed a very keen interest in ensuring that your case proceeds without obstruction," the judge continued, her tone clipped and professional, though her fingers drummed anxiously on the desk. "That includes ensuring that you are given every opportunity to present your evidence and complete your testimony." Damon's brows shot up. The Department of Justice. The judge's jaw tightened. "I don't know how this case came to their attention, but I've been strongly advised to ensure that Ms. Allen's rights are fully protected under federal law." For the first time in hours, Teresa's voice failed her. She could only stare at the judge, her mind reeling. "Effective immediately," the judge continued, "Ms. Allen will be allowed to present her full case, including any evidence discovered after initial disclosures. All objections relating to procedural timing will be overruled." Damon's breath caught. "That's unprecedented." "It is," Judge Corman agreed, her mouth a thin line. "And yet, here we are." Teresa found her voice at last, soft but firm. "Does this mean they're watching my case from Washington?" The judge's expression softened, just for a fraction of a second. "It would seem so." A silence fell over the room, heavy with implications neither Teresa nor Damon had time to process. "Sergeant Whittaker," the judge said abruptly, turning to the officer standing near the door, "please escort Ms. Allen back to the courtroom. Ensure that no further interference occurs." The officer's jaw flexed, but he nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." As Teresa rose, the judge called her back one last time. "Ms. Allen." She turned, expecting another cold directive. But Judge Corman's expression, though still guarded, carried a glimmer of something, almost human. "Use this chance wisely," the judge said. "Not everyone gets one." Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. What had once been stacked against Teresa was now teetering toward something new. Not justice, not yet, but the possibility of it. And possibilities were sometimes all a person needed to change everything. As Teresa settled back into her seat, Damon leaned close, his voice low. "I don't know who's watching," he whispered, "but whoever they are, they just gave us the opening we needed." Teresa's hand trembled slightly beneath the table. "I just want them to listen," she whispered back. And for the first time, they just might. The balance of power shifts. When Teresa walked back into courtroom 4A, the air felt different. It wasn't just the faint hum of whispered conversations or the anxious shuffling of papers. It was the way the space itself seemed to have tilted, like the room was leaning ever so slightly in her direction, not out of kindness, but out of sheer necessity. Power was no longer locked firmly in the hands of her former employer, or even Judge Corman. A new force had stepped into the room. Unseen, unnamed, but undeniable. Washington was watching. The moment Teresa and Damon re-entered, the hum of conversation died down. Every eye in the courtroom turned to her, including those of Braybridge's lawyers, who now sat unnaturally still, like statues carved out of polished anxiety. Gone were the smug smirks and casual arrogance they'd worn when the hearing began. Now their glances darted toward the door, as if they expected a team of federal investigators to burst through at any moment. Damon, who had spent his career fighting uphill battles in courtrooms like this one, had to mask his own astonishment. Whatever call had come from the White House, it hadn't just thrown the courtroom off balance. It had done something almost impossible. It had made them matter. Teresa sat carefully, her back straight, her hands folded on the table, but her mind was racing. She still didn't know who had made that call or why. Was it a civil rights group? Someone she'd never met who had caught wind of her case? Or was it a stranger in power, someone who saw in her story something that struck a nerve, something they couldn't let go ignored? Whatever the answer, it was too big to process now. The judge returned a moment later, her black robe swaying as she walked, her face an unreadable mask of judicial professionalism. But to Teresa, the tension was obvious. A quiet battle was raging inside Judge Corman, a struggle between her natural authority and the blunt reminder that, in this case, someone above her was holding the reins. The gavel tapped lightly, but it didn't need to. The room was already silent. Let the record reflect that proceedings are resuming after an unscheduled recess. Judge Corman said, her voice cool but controlled. Counsel for Ms. Allen, you may present your new evidence. Damon stood, smoothing his tie with fingers that trembled slightly, though his voice was steady when he spoke. Thank you, Your Honor. He turned toward the screen at the front of the courtroom, where the projector flickered to life, displaying a series of emails, some innocuous on the surface, others venomous in their subtext. We recently obtained these internal communications, Damon began. They show a disturbing pattern of behavior within Braybridge & Co., specifically involving the treatment of Ms. Allen. The screen displayed an email from one of Teresa's former supervisors, a short message sent between executives. I'm not sure Teresa fits the image we want to present. Clients expect a certain polish, if you know what I mean. It was subtle, coded in corporate vagueness, but the meaning was clear. Teresa was too black, too other, for the comfort of white clients. Teresa clenched her hands beneath the table. She remembered that supervisor well, a man who had smiled to her face while quietly chiseling away at her career. Damon continued, clicking through email after email, each message peeling back another layer of the toxic corporate culture Teresa had endured for years. Some were less subtle than others. Let's steer her away from the leadership track. Optics are important right now. Do we have someone less urban who can handle the pitch to Cornerstone? The phrases hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Braybridge's lead attorney stood up, her posture tense. Objection, Your Honor. These emails lack context and do not prove discriminatory intent. Damon didn't even pause. Actually, Your Honor, we have context. Here's an email from Ms. Allen's direct supervisor, admitting that her client satisfaction scores were among the highest in the firm, even while these conversations were happening. A new email flashed on the screen, dated just a week before Teresa was fired. Teresa's work is consistently excellent, but there are other factors to consider. Some clients may not relate to her style. We need someone more familiar to lead going forward. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Judge Corman's jaw was tight, her pen tapping against her legal pad. Objection overruled, she said, voice clipped. Continue. The defense attorney sat heavily, her face pale. Damon's voice softened as he turned toward Teresa. Ms. Allen, can you describe how these attitudes affected your career? Teresa stood, her legs trembling just enough that she had to grip the table's edge. I knew, she said quietly. I knew they were looking past me long before anyone said it out loud. They called it feedback, but it was always the same. Too bold, too direct, too visible. She swallowed, her voice thickening. I gave 20 years to Braybridge. I mentored employees. I built client relationships that made them millions. But no matter what I did, I was always just a little too much of who I am. And eventually, they decided that was too much to keep. The silence stretched, so heavy it felt physical. Braybridge's lead attorney cleared her throat, standing once more. Ms. Allen, do you have any proof that race was the primary factor in your termination? Teresa looked directly at her, not with anger, but with a calm forged in fire. These emails are proof, she said. But so are the 20 years of watching white colleagues, less experienced, less qualified, Get the jobs I was told I wasn't ready for. She took a breath. I was never too much. I was just too black. The words landed with a thud, echoing through the silent room. Damon sat down beside her, his hand resting briefly on her wrist, a silent anchor. For the first time, Judge Corman's expression softened, only slightly, but enough for Teresa to notice. The defense attorney's objections grew increasingly desperate, arguing that corporate decisions were complex and based on multiple factors. But the emails told their own story, and for once, the story couldn't be silenced. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Sergeant Kyle Whittaker stood watching the proceedings on a monitor mounted near the clerk's station. He'd spent most of his career believing his job was to maintain order, to follow instructions, to enforce the rules without question. But watching Teresa stand there, her voice steady, her truth laid bare for the world to see, something cracked open inside him. He remembered the feel of his hand on her arm earlier that day, how easily he'd slipped into the role of enforcer, ready to remove her just to keep things moving. He hadn't thought about what it meant, not really. But now, watching her fight, and win ground she should never have had to fight for in the first place, Whittaker felt something unfamiliar. Shame. He couldn't fix what he'd done, but maybe, just maybe, he could do better. Inside the courtroom, Teresa's voice grew stronger with each word, each piece of evidence, each truth she had been forced to swallow for 2 decades. She didn't know who had made the call to the White House. She didn't know if she'd win. But for the first time in her life, she was no longer invisible, and the world was finally listening. A ripple becomes a wave. The courtroom had emptied, but Teresa could still feel the weight of its gaze pressing against her back. Even with the case in recess for the afternoon, her heart hadn't slowed. Each beat thudded in her ears like the echo of the gavel, marking time between the life she'd known and the life she was stumbling into. A life under a spotlight she'd never asked for. The judge's shift had been unmistakable. Whatever power had reached down from Washington, it had not only changed the course of the hearing, but recalibrated the very air around her. The once invincible defense team no longer had their smug armor. The judge's skeptical detachment had given way to careful neutrality, as though some invisible hand was keeping score. But even with that shift, even with the White House's invisible shadow looming over the proceedings, Teresa knew better than to believe victory was guaranteed. Her phone was buzzing again. She and Damon had retreated to a quiet conference room just off the main corridor, where stale coffee lingered in the air, and the scratched table was littered with sticky notes and printed emails. Damon's legal pad was a battlefield of scribbles, arrows, and question marks, a visual representation of their uphill fight. "Your phone's been going off for the last 10 minutes, Damon said, flipping through his notes. "Might be Eva." Teresa's stomach flipped. Ava, her 16-year-old daughter, the one person she hadn't had time to fully explain any of this to. She glanced at the screen. It wasn't Ava. It was an unknown number. Her instinct was to let it ring, but something, maybe the same invisible hand that had placed the White House's call to the judge, made her swipe to answer. "Ms. Allen." The voice on the other end was low, professional, with the clipped efficiency of someone used to power. "Yes." Teresa's voice was cautious. "This is Kenneth Doyle, Deputy Director of Civil Rights at the Department of Justice." There was no preamble. "I wanted to personally inform you that your case has been flagged for federal oversight." Teresa froze, exchanging a glance with Damon, who immediately pulled out a notebook. "Federal oversight," she repeated, heart stuttering. "Yes, given the evidence presented and the emerging picture of systemic discrimination at Braybridge & Co., we're preparing to open a broader investigation into their hiring and promotion practices. I wanted you to know that you're not alone in this." Teresa leaned back in her chair, disbelief washing over her. She'd come into this hearing just hoping to be heard. Now her case was becoming the tip of the spear. "Mr. Doyle," she said, her voice careful, "why is the Department of Justice involved?" "This isn't. This isn't exactly a national case. There was a slight pause. It is now. The words hit like a punch to the chest. I can't say much more at this stage, Doyle added, but let me be clear. Someone in this administration took a personal interest in your case. Sometimes, these things start with a phone call from someone who saw your story online. Sometimes, it's more personal. Regardless, you have eyes on this now. Use that leverage. The call ended, leaving Teresa staring at her phone. Leverage, she repeated softly. Damon leaned forward. That's a hell of a call. It's terrifying, she admitted. Damon's brow furrowed. Why? Because they're not just watching Braybridge, Teresa said. They're watching me. Every word I say. Every move I make. She shook her head. I didn't ask for this spotlight. Maybe not, Damon said gently, but you've got it. And if you play this right, it's not just your case we can win. It's every case like yours. The weight of it all settled into her chest, a burden and a gift, all at once. The media storm. By the time Teresa left the courthouse that evening, the storm had already begun. A small crowd of reporters had gathered on the courthouse steps. Not a mob, but enough to draw attention. Their cameras snapped the moment the doors swung open, and Teresa felt Damon's hand rest lightly on her shoulder, a reminder that she wasn't walking out alone. Ms. Allen, a reporter pushed forward. How does it feel to have your case under federal review? Did you expect intervention from the White House? Another asked. Teresa paused at the top step, the setting sun casting long shadows across the cracked concrete. I came here today, she said, her voice calm but carrying, to tell the truth, to stand up for myself after years of being silenced. I didn't expect anyone to pay attention, but now that they are, I hope they're paying attention to every worker who's ever been passed over, dismissed, or silenced because of who they are. The cameras clicked faster. Damon gave her a quick nod. It was exactly the message they needed. Unexpected allies. That night, Teresa's email inbox overflowed. Some messages were vicious, the usual vitriol that appeared any time a black woman dared to demand her voice be heard. But many were supportive. Some were from former Braybridge employees, sharing their own stories of discrimination and subtle exclusion. Others came from strangers. Black women, Latino professionals, even white allies who admitted they had looked the other way too often. One email stood out. Subject: I owe you the truth. It was from Melanie Cruz, a former junior account executive who had once worked under Teresa's mentorship. Ms. Allen, I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you. You were the only manager who took the time to mentor me, who actually made me feel like I belonged. I saw what they did to you. I saw the jokes, the exclusion, the way they rewrote your story to justify pushing you out. If you need me to testify, if you need me to tell the truth, I will. I'm scared, but I'm ready. Thank you for being brave first. Teresa's hands shook as she read the words, tears burning the edges of her vision. Family and fear. Teresa sat on her bed later that night, her laptop balanced on her knees. Ava curled up beside her. They were both watching the evening news, which was already running segments on the case. Ava nudged her arm. Mom, you're like famous. Teresa smiled weakly. That's not always a good thing, baby. Ava's smile faded. Are people going to say bad stuff about you? Probably, Teresa admitted. But the truth matters more than what people say. Ava leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. I'm proud of you. Teresa's throat tightened, and she kissed the top of Ava's head. I'm doing this for you too, you know, so you don't ever have to feel like you're too much for anyone. Ava's hand slipped into hers, small and soft, but fierce. The firm in freefall. At Braybridge, the fallout had already begun. Internal memos were flying. Lawyers were scrambling to get ahead of the DOJ investigation, and senior executives were already discussing who to sacrifice to save themselves. The HR director had quietly updated their LinkedIn profile, sensing that they'd be the first to fall. But it was the emails, the ones Teresa had surfaced, that terrified them most. They weren't just ugly. They were evidence. And with the White House watching, this wasn't going away quietly. Teresa stood at her window late that night, looking out at the quiet street below. The day had been a storm, and the next would be no calmer. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone. She felt the weight of every voice that had been silenced before her, and the weight of every voice still waiting for their turn. She was no longer just Teresa Allen. She was the crack in the wall. And the wall was starting to fall. The storm breaks open. The storm that had been brewing around Teresa Allen didn't just break, it exploded. By the time the sun rose the next day, her face was everywhere. Morning news anchors dissected her case between weather updates and traffic reports. Legal analysts speculated on what the Department of Justice's interest meant for corporate America. Civil rights leaders called her a modern David standing against a corporate Goliath. Social media was on fire. Hashtag #StandWithTeresa was trending across platforms, fueled by influencers, labor rights groups, and regular people sharing their own workplace horror stories. And Teresa was just trying to breathe. She sat at her modest kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold beside her, her phone vibrating with near-constant notifications. It had been like this all night, a cascade of emails, texts, and calls from people she'd never met, but who suddenly had opinions about her life. Some were encouraging, some were hateful. But the worst ones were from Braybridge insiders, her former colleagues, people who hadn't spoken to her in years, now scrambling to save themselves. The company fractures. Across town, in Braybridge's glassy downtown headquarters, the crisis team was in full meltdown mode. The CEO, Jeffrey Lance, sat at the head of a long, polished table, his tie loosened, his graying hair damp with sweat. "We're hemorrhaging credibility," the head of public relations said, flipping through a printout of news headlines. Braybridge under fire for racial bias. Emails revealed discrimination culture. This is spiraling beyond damage control. The company's lead attorney, Meredith Connors, leaned forward, her carefully manicured nails clicking against her tablet. "We need to offer a settlement immediately. The longer this drags out, the more it fuels the narrative that we're guilty." Jeffrey's jaw clenched. "A settlement looks like an admission of guilt. Because we are guilty," came a voice from the far end of the table. Head swiveled toward Stephanie Liang, the company's head of HR. Her arms were crossed, her expression grim. "We ignored complaints. We dismissed warnings. This isn't just Teresa Allen's story. There are others, and they're watching." A silence settled over the room. Everyone knew Stephanie was right, but admitting it out loud was something entirely different. Jeffrey's knuckles whitened around the edge of the table. "We don't admit anything until we're legally required to. Offer her money. A public apology. Then we put this behind us." Meredith's voice was cautious. "With the DOJ involved, I don't think it's going to be that simple." It wasn't. Because while they were plotting containment, Teresa was finding her voice. A growing chorus. The first interview request Teresa agreed to wasn't from a major network or some flashy anchor looking for viral soundbites. It was from a small, independent podcast hosted by a young black woman named Sierra Grant, someone who understood what it felt like to walk into a room and know you were already considered too much. They met in a small community center, just the two of them, and a single microphone between them. Teresa's hands trembled slightly as Sierra hit record, but the words came anyway. "They tried to make me disappear," Teresa said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "They thought if they escorted me out of the courtroom, if they ignored the evidence, if they painted me as difficult or angry or entitled, that I'd just go away." Sierra leaned forward, eyes bright with empathy. "But you didn't." "No," Teresa said, "because if I disappeared, what would that say to every black woman still sitting at those desks, working twice as hard for half the recognition? What would that say to my daughter?" The episode aired that afternoon. Within hours, it was shared over 1 million times. It wasn't just Teresa's story anymore. It was every black woman's story. Every worker passed over, dismissed, retaliated against for speaking up. People flooded the comments with their own experiences, and for the first time, Teresa realized she wasn't just fighting for herself. Pressure and paranoia. With each passing day, the pressure mounted. Journalists camped outside her house, snapping photos whenever she stepped outside to grab the mail. Activists and community leaders left messages offering support, some genuine, others clearly trying to attach themselves to the growing spotlight. And then there were the threats. They came via email, anonymous phone calls, even scrawled notes left under her windshield wiper. Know your place. Drop the case or we'll come for you. Lying black bitch. Teresa's hands shook as she read them, but she refused to show fear in public. She was afraid, but fear had been her companion for too long already. Damon insisted they notify the police, but Teresa hesitated. The same system that had once dragged her out of a courtroom in front of her peers was now supposed to protect her. But after the third anonymous threat, she agreed, reluctantly. The return of Sergeant Whittaker. It was Sergeant Kyle Whittaker who was assigned to handle the security review. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. When he knocked on her door, Teresa almost didn't open it, but when she saw him standing there, his uniform crisp, his eyes different somehow, she relented. "Ms. Allen," he said quietly, "I'm here about the threats." She let him in, and they stood awkwardly in her living room, sunlight slanting through the blinds onto her stack of legal folders. "I don't expect you to trust me," Whittaker said after a moment, "but I want you to know I've been thinking about that day in court, about how quick I was to follow orders instead of asking why." Teresa folded her arms across her chest. "What changed?" Whittaker glanced down, shifting awkwardly. "You. The way you stood there, even when I put my hand on your arm. You didn't flinch. You didn't shrink." His voice softened. "I've been a cop for 17 years, Ms. Allen. I thought I knew who the troublemakers were. I was wrong." The apology was raw, unpolished, but Teresa could tell it was sincere. She didn't know if she could forgive him yet, but at least now he saw her as more than a case file. "Thank you," she said quietly. And just like that, an enemy became a reluctant ally. The leverage game. Braybridge's first settlement offer came the next morning. A lowball figure, just enough to make them feel like they'd done something. Teresa rejected it without a second thought. The second offer was better. Money, a quiet apology, and a non-disclosure agreement meant to bury the story forever. She rejected that too. Damon smiled when she told him. "They're scared." "Good," Teresa said. "They should be." With the DOJ circling, media attention intensifying, and former employees stepping forward with their own stories of racial bias, the company was in freefall. Stock prices were dropping, clients were reevaluating contracts, and even some board members were whispering about replacing the CEO. The cracks Teresa had spent years trying to expose were now visible to the world. But even as her power grew, so did the risk. The personal toll. That night, Teresa stood at her bathroom sink, washing off the makeup she'd worn for her latest interview. Her reflection stared back at her, the tired eyes, the new lines on her forehead, the weight of the fight etched into her skin. Eva stood in the doorway, watching. "Mom." Teresa turned, smiling through her exhaustion. "Yeah, baby. Are we going to be okay?" Teresa knelt, pulling Ava into her arms. "We're going to be more than okay." And for the first time, she believed it. Because this time, they were fighting back. The weight of one voice. The conference room, where the final settlement negotiations were set to take place, had no windows, only 4 walls, 2 lawyers, and the kind of silence that hummed louder than conversation ever could. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer ink, but to Teresa Allen, it smelled like the end of a war. Damon sat beside her, legal pad at the ready, though they both knew the real battle was no longer over dollars and cents. It was about power, who had it, and who was about to lose it. Across the table sat Braybridge's lead attorney, Meredith Connors, her once confident smile now a brittle mask, cracking at the edges. To her right was Jeffrey Lance, the CEO himself, a man who had, until now, made a fortune without ever having to know the names of people like Teresa Allen. The meeting began with the customary pleasantries, meaningless acknowledgments of the importance of resolving the matter amicably. Teresa tuned them out. She wasn't here for niceties. She was here for truth. Damon slid the latest settlement offer across the table, a sum that would have been unimaginable months ago. But Teresa barely glanced at the number. She was here for something more valuable than money. She was here for a reckoning. "I have some conditions," Teresa said, her voice quiet but unwavering. Jeffrey's eyes narrowed slightly. "We're already offering a generous package." "This isn't about generosity," Teresa said. "It's about accountability." Meredith forced a smile. "Of course, Ms. Allen. Please outline your requests." Teresa took a breath. "First, the public apology. I want it issued to every employee, past and present. Not just a press release buried on your website. A real statement, signed by Mr. Lance, acknowledging that racial discrimination occurred." Jeffrey bristled. "We can't admit wrongdoing." "Then you can take your offer and shove it," Teresa said evenly. "And we can all meet back in court when the Department of Justice files their civil rights lawsuit." The room froze. Damon's smile was subtle, but full of satisfaction. Teresa had learned the game, and now she was playing it better than they were. Meredith's fingers clenched around her pen. "What else?" Teresa's voice grew stronger. "A third-party audit of all hiring, promotion, and termination practices for the last 10 years. Full access granted to the DOJ and made available to all employees." Jeffrey's mouth opened, but Teresa cut him off before he could protest. "And finally, mandatory bias and anti-discrimination training for all leadership, overseen not by some PR-friendly consultant, but by a civil rights organization chosen by the affected employees." "You're asking for the company to overhaul its entire HR infrastructure," Jeffrey said, voice tight with disbelief. "No," Teresa said. "I'm asking you to stop pretending that this was a misunderstanding. I'm asking you to stop hurting people like me." The silence that followed was thick with decades of injustice, all funneled into this one moment, in this one room, where the balance of power had shifted, and Teresa held the scales, the call that changed it all. Later that evening, Teresa sat on her porch, her fingers curled around a cup of tea, the night air cool against her skin. The settlement had been agreed to, all her terms, every last one. Damon had been stunned. "They didn't even counter," he said, shaking his head. "They just folded." Teresa didn't tell him the real reason why. The call had come that morning, before the meeting, a withheld number. When Teresa answered, the voice on the other end was soft, measured, familiar in the way history is familiar. "Ms. Allen," the voice said, "I wanted to thank you for your courage." Teresa's breath caught. "Who is this?" "I can't officially say," the voice replied, "but let's just say some of us in Washington are rooting for you." There was a pause. "People like you, Ms. Allen. People who speak up when it's easier to stay silent. You're the reason we're able to push for real change. You remind us what the fight is really about." Teresa swallowed hard. "Thank you," she whispered. "But why me?" The voice was quiet for a moment. "Because we've all had a Teresa in our lives, someone who deserved better." The line went dead, but the words stayed with her. The fallout at Braybridge. Within days, the public apology was issued. It wasn't the sanitized, PR-approved nonsense Teresa had expected. It was raw. An admission that the company had failed to uphold basic principles of fairness, that employees had suffered, and that those responsible were being removed from leadership. Jeffrey Lance retired, effective immediately. 3 senior managers were fired, including Teresa's former boss, who was escorted from the building in front of staff, just as Teresa had once been. Employees, black, brown, white, gathered in break rooms and whispered that the ground had shifted. The silence that had protected Braybridge's culture for so long had been shattered, and Teresa Allen's name was on everyone's lips. The national stage. Teresa's story didn't end with the settlement. Invitations flooded in, from law schools wanting her to speak about corporate accountability, from civil rights groups asking her to help train workplace advocates, from national media outlets wanting to turn her story into a symbol. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't a public speaker or an activist. She was a woman who just wanted to be treated fairly. But something in her shifted when Eva came home from school one afternoon, grinning ear to ear. "My history teacher talked about you today," Eva said. "She called you a trailblazer." Teresa's heart clenched. A trailblazer. She hadn't asked for that title. But maybe, just maybe, she could live up to it. The conversation with Sergeant Whittaker. Before she left the courthouse for good, Teresa had one more conversation to have. She found Sergeant Whittaker standing outside the courthouse, leaning against the stone pillar, watching the sun dip low over the parking lot. "I heard you're transferring," Teresa said softly. He turned, surprised, then nodded. "Community Outreach Unit." She smiled faintly. "That's a good place to make changes." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "I know my apology doesn't erase what happened, but I see things differently now." Teresa let the silence hang for a beat. Seeing differently is a good start. They stood there for a moment, the unlikely pair, the enforcer and the woman who refused to be silenced, before Whittaker reached into his pocket and held out a small notebook. "What's this?" Teresa asked. "Notes from that day," he said. "The day I tried to remove you. I kept them. Figured you might want them." She took the notebook, fingers brushing his. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it. The legacy. Months later, Teresa stood on a stage at a national labor rights conference, Ovid in the front row, Damon beside her, Melanie Cruz, her former mentee, standing proudly at her side. The room was packed with workers, lawyers, advocates, people who had been dismissed, overlooked, and silenced. She looked out at the crowd and took a deep breath. "I didn't set out to be a symbol," she said. "I just wanted to tell the truth." She looked at Ava. "But now I know. The truth doesn't live in one voice. It lives in all of us." The applause was deafening. Teresa Allen had walked into that courtroom thinking she was alone. She walked out knowing she had started a movement.